Good afternoon. My name is Byung-Joon Kim from Korea. The title that I would like to present today is the introduction of Chinese characters into Korea. And the subtitle is The Critical Review on the Role of Lelang Commandery in Japanese pronunciation, Alakro-kun. And before I start my main parts, so I'd like to survey the basic idea. The main theme of mine is the diffusion of Chinese characters into the regional areas. And the period that my paper will cover will be the incipient stage of the diffusion. And the method that I would like to use is the historical perspective. And everybody knows that the high culture will flow to the lower culture, the lower region. But as a historian, I like to analyze not only this kind of the principle, the cultural flow, but I rather focus on the background or concrete agent for this diffusion. And lastly, the area that I would like to cover is the Korean case. And though the Korean case, it just occupies one corner of the continent, but I think this Korean case can be applied to the other areas. Okay, now I'll start the presentation, and I'll read some parts of my paper, and sometimes I like to show you my PPT just for your easy understanding. And yeah, first the first chapter, introduction. Prior to the invention of Hangul, or the Korean alphabet, in the 15th century, the Koreans wrote exclusively in Hanja, kanji, or Chinese characters, which they borrowed from China. And Chinese characters developed in China to suit the particular linguistic needs of the Chinese. So hence, when Koreans borrowed Chinese characters, their usage turned out to be extremely inconvenient because of the linguistic structural differences between spoken Chinese and spoken Korean. To help overcome some of the differences, the Koreans developed a writing system called Lidu, in Chinese Lidu, to represent the old Korean language by borrowing Chinese characters. However, it was not so easy to simply borrow them and to change the specific elements of them only when necessary. So much time and effort were required before Chinese characters and the linguistic traits of the people on the peninsula could come to terms with each other. When users could fully familiarize themselves with the Chinese borrowing writing system. In other words, there should have been a long process of linguistic contacts and adaptation. In understanding the acceptance and the transformation of Chinese characters in ancient times in Korea, in Korean peninsula, the key point rests with the differences in linguistic traits and attendant inconveniences. Lidu, obviously was one such byproduct. However, while overemphasizing differences, the consideration about the process has been omitted or noticeably reduced. A considerable process of acceptance is to be presupposed if transformation are to occur. With this in mind, this paper will explain the introduction of Chinese characters into Korean peninsula. It does so by trying to uncover the background when transformation of Chinese characters occurred in Korea, and by discussing when and how they were introduced and the extent to which they were used. Let me briefly survey again. There was linguistic differences between spoken Chinese and spoken Korean. So, in result, there was inconveniences for Koreans to use Chinese characters. So, at last, eventually, the Yidu, Lidu have burst. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to analyze the background of its birth, especially with the help of the case of this Lelang commentary. Okay, and for your understanding, I would like to review the previous studies, but I'll be on the critical perspective. One of the major reasons that the study of the introduction of Chinese characters is largely stagnant is because of a misunderstanding of Korean history. Existing studies find the origin of Korean history with Guo Zhousen and Gu Changxian, while placing the Han commentaries inside the Chinese history. While this paper does not intend to redefine the scope of Korean and Chinese historiography, but an existing historiographies obscure the relationship between the Han commentaries and the acceptance of Chinese characters within the peninsula. So in other words, while Goguryeo, Gaoguli, and Baekje, Baiji, for instance, have come to present linguistic traits of Koreans, the four commentaries of the Han Dynasty, including Lelang commentary, have often been neglected from the discussion of Koreans' acceptance of Chinese characters. However, the Han Dynasty four commentaries, including Lelang commentary, as political power bases, should be appraised positively from the perspective of the acceptance of Chinese characters. First, Gaoguli and Baiji have had contact with adjacent to four Han commentaries. Thus, in order to understand Gaoguli's acceptance of Chinese characters, we need to precisely understand how the Chinese characters came into use in the four Han commentaries. And second, it is evident that the four commentaries were built by the Han Chinese. However, it is also evident that those under the administration of the commentaries were not all ethnically Han. Accordingly, they should not necessarily be excluded. They means non-Han people who lives in the commentaries. They should not necessarily be excluded from the process of introducing Chinese characters into Korean Peninsula simply because they were dwelling in the commentaries. And third point that I'd like to criticize is the existing studies argue that only the Han people in the commentaries had the command of Chinese characters, while the other people, the non-Han general populace, were excluded from the use of Chinese characters. But I think this is the result of misunderstanding. As I discussed below, the distinction between the Han and the non-Han people was not important in the commentary. As many people as possible were to be incorporated into the commentary administration. Meanwhile, it is also necessary to have a specific understanding of the level of Chinese characters when they were first introduced into Peninsula. First, the previous studies have overlooked the various stages of learning Chinese characters. As you know well, today, various definitions of the literacy are imaginable. UNESCO defines the literacy as the ability to understand, read, and write in short and simple words in day-to-day life. However, there are so many stages of literacy. For example, the highest level is to understand and write down the very highest knowledge of philosophy. But the lowest one is just to write down a very simple word, very simple characters. So the lowest one can be included into the category of the literacy. Now, however, the previous studies overlook this range of the literacy and assume only a single form of Chinese characters introduced into Peninsula at a relatively high level of literacy. So, for example, the establishment of the Taixue, this very highest education the school, as a National Confucian Academy, as an educational institution, or the acceptance of the four books, Si Shu. If these things are installed, or these things happen to be found in the Peninsula, then we may say the Chinese characters were introduced. But but I think it's this problem. And second, the perception that Chinese characters were always highly standardized when they were introduced is also problematic. In other words, there existed the variations in Chinese characters before they were introduced into Korean Peninsula. As mentioned, the previous studies have generalized the introduction of Chinese characters into Korea while trying to view the usage of non-standard characters as a transformation unique to Korean Peninsula. However, as I mentioned above, it should also be noted that such variations tailored to the Korean linguistic needs of the people were already found in the continental China. It means that old Koreans might have accepted already transformed Chinese. So I'd like to return again. So, in short, briefly speaking, I like to assert that there are the three misconceptions of the previous studies. And the first one is they like to attribute the first Korean contact with the Chinese characters to Gaoguli, not the Lelang. And second one is they tend to neglect the existence of non-Han people in Lelang commentary. And third problem is they are inclined to simplify the range of using Chinese characters in Lelang commentary. And there are also another problems neglected in way of introduction. They neglected several stages of literacy from simple one to the complex one. And they also neglected the various dialects in mainland Han China. And I just criticized the previous studies. And with this base, then I'd like to introduce when the Chinese characters were introduced into Korea at first. As far as the historical records are concerned, the first period is the Weiman Joseon, Weiman Changxian. But the evidence is so scant. But the Weiman, a figure who fled from China to Korean Peninsula, has the Ian origin. So it means he is already accustomed to the Chinese documentary system. So he and his colleagues might be aware of this Chinese character. And his historical record says the Weiman Chaoxian had written a lot of petitions to Han Dynasty instead of the other tribes adjacent to the Weiman Chaoxian. And so if the Weiman Chaoxian had written the petitions instead of the other people, that it means the Weiman Chaoxian had already aware of the Chinese characters. And third one is there were some the written laws. It also means that they were aware of the Chinese characters. But however, this evidence is so scant, so we cannot dare to say the Chinese characters were introduced in this Weiman Chaoxian. So let's move on. The Lelang commentary. 108 BC, Han Wudi perished the Gu Chaoxian, in the Korean Peninsula, and they installed the Lelang commentary in the Korean Peninsula. So if you see and if you analyze the system of this Lelang commentary, we can find a lot more news about the introduction of Chinese characters. So in this session, I'd like to talk about three things. The first one is in the commentary system, there was a very strict principle. That is, according to the laws of the Qin Han period, all the matters must be managed and kept in documents. So it means the commentary system was managed by the way of documents. And it also says that the people who are involved in this commentary system should be aware of the Chinese characters. And second point that I would like to talk is the literacy already expanded among the general populace, not limited to the Han people, the Chinese people, but also it expanded, it infiltrated into the general populace, which has a non-Han origin. So it means there's a lot of people who are aware of these Chinese characters in Lelang commentary, and they do not have the Chinese origin. And third point that I might talk is this, as I just mentioned, the non-Han people were also put into this documentary system. So, in short, if we just due to the time limit, I would like to read. I don't read the PDF paper, but in short, in Lelang commentary, there are so many non-Han people, the so-called Korean people, were put into this documentary system, and the documentary system, all the matters must be managed and kept in documents. So everybody might be aware of the Chinese characters. Not only the Chinese people, but also Korean people are aware of this Chinese character. And third section of my paper is about the contact with the various usages and the choices. The reason why that I do analyze in this session is, just in other words, the purpose of this third section is to criticize the previous studies, because the previous studies assert that there was just one usage of Chinese characters, which was used in the government, the central government, and this kind of only one usage could be found in the Confucian canons. But as far as I know, or if you just made a reference of the wooden slates which was excavated in Jiyan and Dunhuang, there are a lot of usages of Chinese characters. So the first one is the various usages according to region and personal states. That I mean, there are a lot of usages according to the region to region, and time to time, and person to person. And the Lelang people, so those Korean people who lived in Lelang commentary, had already contacted with these various usages for more than 400 years, because these people are already involved in the Junxian, are involved in the commentary and prefecture system. So, after this over 400 years, the Lelang people and Korean people are so accustomed to these kind of Chinese characters, and finally they felt the kind of the inconveniences with their linguistic customs, because the Chinese characters are not suitable to the Korean people and suitable to Korean linguistic needs. So eventually they selected the one which is suitable to their linguistic needs. So let me show some examples. The Korean linguists, and including the Japanese linguists, assume that there are many examples of the first incipient stage of the Yidu. If you just consult with the Gaoguli or Baiji inscriptions, then you can find some very strange Chinese character. The first one is a Zhong. And if you see the Korean one, then you may find it's a little bit different from the Chinese one. And they think, oh, it is not a Chinese one, but the Korean invented the one which is called as a Yidu. For example, Zhong does not have any meaning of in the middle of, but they just take on the post-positional locative case marker, like 99 And there's another example is zhi. And as you know well, in Chinese, the zhi means a pronoun. But if you see the Korean inscriptions, then you may find there is no meaning at all, but just have the terminating ending, like in Japan's 99 ta. And third one is the jie. Jie means in Korean inscriptions does not have the Chinese meaning, but just have a directing or the subjective particle, like in Japanese 99 ga. These are the assertions which was studied by the Korean and Japanese linguists. But if you see more closely wooden slips excavated in Jiyan and Hanjian, we can find the same as the Korean inscriptions. If you see the first one, there is a one zhong, but this character does not have a meaning of in the middle of. Just like the Korean inscriptions, they just take on the case marker. They don't have any meaning. But it can be found in the Chinese wooden slips, Chinese official documents, not only in Korean Peninsula, but in Chinese mainland. And you can see the number 2, and there is a zhi, and this zhi character also does not have any the pronouns meaning. So what I mean is, you can find more examples which is very similar to the Korean Peninsula. So it is not invented by the Korean people, but also already used by the Chinese people. And third one is the same as I talked. Jie. If you just see the Korean one, the jie, for example, in Korean, jie means the subjective particle. So it does not make sense. But if you see the Han documents, then on jie is the little bit abbreviation of the ji. So it has the same meaning. So if you replace this jie with the ji, then it does make sense. So what I'd like to talk in this session is some examples which the Korean scholars and previous studies argues that these should be the Korean invention of the lidu, can be found in Chinese documents, especially the wooden documents, especially in excavated wooden documents. And these documents were circulated in the commandery system. And the Lelang, the Lelang commandery, is also involved in this, the empire, the commandery system. So the Lelang people, the Korean people, could understand, could have contact with this kind of a lot of usages. So after all, they selected these kind of zhong, zhi, ji, just because these kind of three things are so suitable to their linguistic needs. So they selected, and they used for more than 400 years, and they used it. And after the collapse of the Lelang commandery, Li and Baiji has started to use it as its own. So, lastly, I'd like to conclude my session. In short, briefly speaking, in previous studies, I said the Korean and the Chinese characters had been introduced in Goguryeo, and a small amount of elites who had the Chinese origin introduced the Chinese characters into Korea. And the time will be after the flow of Chinese refugees. They neglected the Lelang community, but just said after the collapse of Lelang Commandery, the Chinese refugees came into the Gaoguli, and the Gaoguli people, Korean people, started to know about the Chinese characters, but it's not. And they also said that at that time, the level of the introduction, level of Chinese character, level of that time should be very high. So they said 400 BC, 400 AD, and Taixue and Sanshou Jing has been introduced into Korea. So it means the introduction of Chinese character. But I'd like to assert that not in Korea, but in Lelang Commandery, and not a small amount of elites who has Chinese origins, but a number of non-Han people, and not after the flow of Chinese refugees, but the people, non-Han people, Korean people, who were trained in documentary systems for over 400 years, and not in a very high level, but in a very simple level literacy, the Chinese characters has been introduced into Korea. Okay, thank you.